Last week we talked about filter placement with hang-on back filters and how that can affect the flow within your tank. And today, as you can tell by my terrible pre-done drawings, we're going to talk sponge filtration and all other options when it comes to air-driven filtration. Hello everyone, this is Bentley. It's time for another terrible art class with me, where we're going to talk about flow. And today we're going to do air-driven filtration, and we'll start with sponge filters. Now, one thing I want to talk about first, and let me grab an actual sponge here. Okay. There's a couple things that we need to note when we start with the sponge filter compared to other air-driven filtration methods like box filters or even Undergravel filtration, okay? Because of the design of a sponge filter, right? We have this big sponge, and then the inner workings. What we basically are looking at is just open grating that we either drop an air line into, right? Or we'll have an air line with an air stone. And what that does when this is assembled, right, and our sponge is on it, our sponge is a giant porous surface. It holds beneficial bacteria. It collects all of our detritus. It acts as mechanical filtration. But this area, since it's circular, water flow can come in from all directions. And it's air-powered. Now, that's a little less powerful than a powered filter, yes, but there's some benefits to that. And then the next major thing you need to understand with any given air filter is the distance of the lift tube. So the height of the lift tube increases flow rate. So this is why you'll see in air-powered, like anoxic filtration. Let me set my prop down here. In anoxic-style filtrations where you want slow moving water, you'll purposely make the outflow very short. Whereas in many of our sponge filtrations and box filters, you'll tend to have like telescoping or longer output tubes because they want to generate more flow rate to help pull more and more water through to be a little more effective. So with that being said, let's talk about how the placement matters, okay? So there's two things we should consider here. Let me get a second marker. This is going to matter. The first is this uplift tube, right? And this is the long way of our tank, and this is the same view from the side. We're going to start with one of the classics. We put it in the back corner, right? There's two things that matter here. The amount of detritus that's already collected in our air-driven filtration unit, in this case, the sponge filter. And all that is if it's really fine pores and it's fairly clogged, like down here, let's say that you brought the air stone fairly low so it has the most powerful suction through here, and this starts to get clogged up, right? As this bottom area is clogged up, less water movement can move through here. So it moves steadily through the rest of the sponge until the whole thing is really clogged up. With super coarse filtration, this is a great example here, right? This is a very coarse filter, the Aquarium Co-op version, versus some of like the Swiss Tropicals Poré foam, which is much finer, right? That coarse filtration will hold a lot of detritus, and it won't really clog up. It'll still allow some flow to go through. So it's also won't as finely remove particulates, so it's a careful thing. So as we start to see that happen, right, it would be the same here. As this starts to fill up, we'll get less and less water flow through this bottom portion, and more will be focused in here until the whole thing eventually clogs up. Also, like we talked about, the height of this lift tube here matters as far as the amount of flow rate that can be generated by the air. The more distance the air has to travel before it begins to disperse, right? Because this tube is holding it in a narrow column, and that forces the air as it rises to create suction, right? Suction is actually an interesting gravity-fed thing if you look into the science of how suction properly works. And what happens is the taller this tube is, the faster the flow rate. So let's talk about how water moves with sponge filters in this placement. So if this is the front of our tank, right, because we're in the corner, we're still going to get some water flow through here, and what's going to happen is the water, of course, is going to eject out this way, and it's going to start to dissipate. Now the air will, for the most part, go up, but you're going to have some limited dissipation that happens out. So you're going to have that kind of cone effect, right? Think like your volcano experiments and all those things. But primarily it's going to go up here until it hits water surface, and then that's going to create extra gas exchange and agitation. Down here, because we're restricted on space, there's still some water flow that's going to come back down this way. But the more that we restrict the space, both side to side and front to back here, right? Because we're going to have the same thing. We're going to have our primary flow going straight up. And then we're going to have less and less flow as it disperses outward. If we look at our side profile, but again, this against the back of the glass, there's not as much room for water to move around. So you will have flow, but you're going to notice, and this is an observational thing, that often the closer you put your sponge filter especially to your glass in that kind of back corner methodology, the less you're going to see in the back, and it's more your detritus is going to gather toward the front, because these open spaces, right, there's lots more water flow that's going to come in through this way along your substrate, middle of the tank, right? You got all this stuff that's going to slowly pull inward, and of course as you've got these things going out here, they're going to kind of loop. We're going to get some deflection eventually, because as we agitate the water here, it's going to carry some kinetic energy, right? Some movement. It's going to hit. It's going to deflect against the glass, similar to our powered filtration, but just at a softer scale, right? So you're going to have a majority of your flow here, and it's going to be the same over this way, where you're going to see a lot more front to back if we use the front corner, and very little. So you're going to have like this scope like this, right? The sides and the front, where there's more open space, you're going to slowly have more movement in those areas, but it's going to be gentler because it comes from farther away, right? Where in the most turbulent movement of water you're going to have, and in theory, like the highest flow, is right here at the top, and then right here near this piece of glass. Because it's so close, it has the most kinetic energy as it's dispersing. And that flow will get gentler as it carries across, but what you're going to notice is you will see more of your detritus gather coming from this direction, right, than you will over here in this constricted area. And most of that might be that, like, your fish just aren't in that area, so they're not leaving a lot of detritus over there, etc. And it's the same if we look at the side, right? The top water is where we're going to have the most turbulence here, and here against the glass, right? Forgive my terrible art. But that's where we're going to see the most water movement and turbulence. It's slower than a powered filter, naturally. But you're still going to notice that this larger open space, while it doesn't have more powerful flow, it will have more water movement, if that makes sense. Because it's more open, it's going to have more exposure, and slowly but surely, that suction is going to move more of your detritus over in these areas than over here. This more powerful flow, it just has a little bit more energy, but it's very constrained, so you're less likely to see a lot of fish hiding over there, except for like plecos probably will hide in that area, right? And you're going to deal with a majority of things coming from this outside zone here where it's open. The openness in your tank is going to change that. Now, of course, we could change that entirely. We could install a second sponge filter here, and then we could kind of create this little like vortex, right? Where we've got things moving this way and things moving this way. We can also take the sponge and move it this way. Okay, in this example, we're keeping it toward the back of the tank, but we're placing it more center. You can think of this like something you would do in maybe a 20 gallon or 20 long, something like that, right? Your smaller tanks where you're only going to use one filter and not multiple. The difference here, right? We're going to have very similar flow over here. We're going to have most of our flow coming out and dispersing this way, and you're going to have that more powerful but more turbulent area up through here, and you're going to be restricted in this area, right? Because there's just not a lot of room for things to move. The difference being because we go more center, we have better movement throughout the tank. Because we have these bigger open zones, right? And that exposes more of the sponge filter and more of where that suction is coming from, that big central area, to more areas of the tank that are open. And what you're going to see is basically only this very back of the sponge here against the glass is going to have limited detritus in it over time. You're going to watch it collect, right? But all the rest of it, think of it like if you were cutting a pie, right? It would only be this like little narrow wedge in the back. And the rest of that pie, right, it would get taken up, or we could say eaten in this case, but basically that's where it's going to collect everything else in through here because it has more exposure. So more particulates are going to come from more directions. This is a little more optimal in a small tank especially, but if you start getting those longer tanks is where we're looking at. So like the 20 longs or like even the 33 long, things like that. Those long tanks, right? Center placement is going to give you a little bit better detritus collection because there's more room for this water to flow around and carry things slowly but surely into that filter. Now, granted, we are talking about air-driven filtration, so it matters a lot on the airflow being pushed into here, and that's going to be significantly gentler than any given powered filtration. So don't expect us to collect, like, make the crystallest of crystal clear water, right? But we will still collect a lot of detritus in this thing, in this arrangement. And you could, in theory, do the same thing here, right? If we push this filter dead center of the tank, we've got some crazy idea that we're going to work with. You open up that extra space along here in the back, and then every surrounding edge of that filter now is available to properly collect that detritus and do mechanical filtration. However, despite the fact that the mechanical filtration capability, regardless of placement, changes, right? The biological benefit, aka the bacteria space that can grow, kind of stays the same. Not precisely, I'm sure someone in the comments can like out-science me, Kelly, you'll probably do this or something, but there's still areas where water is flowing and bacteria can be. It just won't be as effective on the mechanical side of the filtration. Now, the big difference here is, let's say that this is a box filter, right? Box filters, where this changes with a box filter versus a sponge, and the flow rates are kind of the same. Excuse me for the loudness of opening my pens here for our fancy art. The only difference is box filters typically have slats like this. I'm using this to show it, but let's say that these are the slats. And what that does is it means that all these areas between the slats, and no box filter is really designed like this, but just bear with me here, right? All these areas between the slats that are solid plastic are restrictive. So your common box filter, right, is kind of like this design here. It's kind of this cup shape. It has some openings down here, and then usually it has a bunch of slats up toward the top, but this is relatively solid. And then all your media, usually like filter floss is in here. The airlift tube goes all the way to the bottom, and it's creating flow. We're speed drawing this one. We thought of this on the fly, right? So you've got your flow is coming like this, and for the most part up here, but you got a limited amount coming in through here, right? And if we were to quickly draw like the uplift tube on our box filter, you'd have this uplift tube here, and the air is starting down this way. So flow kind of goes in that route, right? These restrictions limit the amount of mechanical filtration work that can be done compared to a sponge filter like this, where it's open, the whole thing's very porous, it has much less restriction. It's more restricted on placement than it is on its physical design, like a box filter is. The box filter, still a great filter, don't get me wrong. The only difference is we typically use box filters where we're going to have some kind of substrate or something else that's doing a lot of our biological filtration, and maybe we've got a small amount of media in here. And the mechanical filtration, we're just changing out every time we need to clean it. We're not rinsing it or anything. We're just putting brand new filter floss in there and calling it a day. Where the sponge, we're using as both at the same time. So we're going to clean this, typically in old tank water or something like that. We're just getting the detritus out to free up that mechanical filtration capability, right, to lock in more detritus in the future, to open it up, to declog it, etc., etc. But in like the box filters, usually you got like some biogravel or something down here, and then up through here where a majority of the flow is sitting, or maybe it's, you know, in the center or whatever, it's a bunch of filter floss. And some old school people are just like, nope, all filter floss, I got it covered. I just needed to do water movement and to pick up all my detritus, and everything else is taken care of, right? So this is kind of the difference here. This gets really different, and yet not at all, when we start talking about undergravel filtration. So let me quickly erase this. Let's get an undergravel filtration mock-up going, and we'll talk about that. So here is our basic undergravel filter design. And this is like the undergravel filter plate kits you can buy on Amazon and a majority of pet stores, where you have these plates that create a void or a plenum, however you want to call it. And then you have airlift tubes. And typically, in most common undergravel filtration designs, we want these airlift tubes to go as high as they can reasonably in the tank. Over the top, you have your substrate, whether that's the gravel, so that's going to be represented in red. So here's what we're looking at, okay? The substrate here acts as our mechanical and biological filtration. The plates are there to create a void to help water movement. Now, naturally, the deeper the substrate gets, the more restrictive this becomes, and kind of the slower the movement flow can get down here, especially if we're looking toward the center of the tank. Now, of course, we've got water flow coming up, and we've got that airflow pushing water out of these uplift tubes, and then they'll disperse around. If you have 2 versus 1, you're going to create this kind of like vortex here where things are going to go like this, because eventually, right, the air power is down here somewhere, or it's up potentially inside the tube. A lot of the kits will have a hard air line, and they'll keep the air stone inside the tube here to kind of protect it. And what that does is it means that slowly and surely you're going to have limited water flow kind of through here, right? And it's going to come down to the substrate and get into this open void where, now that it's less restricted, it creates a little bit more movement so that water throughout this entire area is going to move despite the restriction. So instead of like, if it was too restricted and this wasn't open, you would only really get a lot of water movement focusing solely down toward where this primary point of flow is when the uplift tube starts creating suction, right? And the same on this side. Front to back, if we were looking at it that way, it's very similar, right? It's creating this circular movement here where we've got the water flow coming out. It's going to deflect down this way, but a majority is trying to come back this way in through here. However, as it disperses down through here, it's going to move into this open zone and gain that flow rate back because it's no longer restricted. There's some huge benefits to the undergravel filtration system. One, you can make a thicker and thicker layer of gravel to act as more and more mechanical filtration, effectively speaking, and more biological filtration. And depending on the type of substrate you use, this changes. So if you use very fine gravel, not very coarse, it's going to inhibit that movement more, and that's where you start running into potentially anoxic conditions. This isn't a lesson on anoxic filtration. There are far better people to look at that if you want to learn about those things. But what it does is it restricts the movement more through the substrate. Coarser gravels, I think like pea gravel and some of the larger kind of river stone gravels that are beautiful decorative gravel, right? Those leave more room for water to flow around. And so while they don't inhibit the flow as much, you can get a little bit more movement of your water, and that can actually cause more detritus to get locked in there over time, surprisingly enough. Now, there's a lot of different ways you could do this. You could add like a cloth mesh over the top of this to prevent anything from really getting down in here, and then put ceramic media down here to act as an extra biobed and all kinds of crazy. There's all sorts of crazy stuff you need to do, but the basics are just creating a void that helps improve the water flow, prevent restriction, so that this portion stays strong, and then your entire gravel acts as a huge bed for filtration. And this can be extremely good in combination with plants, where plants will take care of some of the nitrites and some of the ammonia, and then the bacteria that is growing in here does the rest of the work for you. This can be extremely effective. There is a reason that basically undergravel filtration was used air-powered from like the 20s until about the 70s, right? 50 years of fish keeping lived off of this design of filtration and was effective. And this isn't to say that it was, it makes anaerobic or anoxic or specifically this. It's just this design. For the most part, if we're doing this correctly and we're leaving this open and we're not creating a massive, thick substrate layer, we are creating aerobic conditions. This isn't as oxygenated as something like a sponge filter, but if we're using a nice coarse gravel through here, it's allowing enough water movement. It's going to trap some of those detrituses and things, and you can come in and gravel vac to remove that stuff when you do your water changes. But overall, it keeps the bacteria in moving water zones because this open plate down here opens up that water flow, helps keep that water flow moving, and thus helps keep oxygen throughout the substrate layer and generates aerobic bacteria. The main difference here is that you could, in a smaller tank, maybe you only have one outflow, and if it's on one side, it's similar to the sponge where it's creating less flow to the side that doesn't have the outflow. But over time, this whole thing, as long as the plate is there, however big the plate is, defines where the most of our movement is. Let's say that like we didn't have this side, but we still had the plate. Because you still have this void all the way over here, even if you don't have this uplift tube, just imagine it's not there. You still have faster moving water regions through here trying to make their way back to the point of the uplift tube. Whereas if we didn't have that plate, let's say we cut it off here and this is all substrate. Since the void is only in this part of the tank, right? Or if we cut it off in the front and it's only this back half as an example, and this is all substrate, or this is all substrate, one or the other, because we don't have that void, this continues to be more and more restricted in its movement, and thus inhibits the amount of flow we're going to see over this way, or again, toward the front of the tank, coming down through the filter material itself. And that's the key point in the difference here. When we talk about any kind of air-powered filtration, it is for the most part talking about the difference in where the flow is moving toward the filtration as opposed to higher flow rates inside the tank. The other thing here is like if you start having obstructions, like, okay, well, I'm going to put this big piece of rock here in the middle, right? I got a big rock and it's got some plants on it and stuff like that. That prevents flow around this, depending on what space it takes up, or wood, or whatever, right? The big broken pirate ship decoration. All these things restrict flow in one way or another. And in the case of undergravel filtration, it's just whatever it's covering over the top, because this area gets kind of locked off, so to speak. Whereas in like sponge filtration, right, it would be this thing that inhibits flow. If the sponge was over here, it would prevent it from coming through this area as easily because there's something restricting the movement. And that's I think, the key difference between powered filtration. Now, granted, powered filtration, restricted movement happens the same, but air-driven filtration, we start caring a little bit more about how the water flow is bringing water to the filtration device and not necessarily purely the movement. Because even as, like, let's say that we did this, right? There's that same rule we had from powered filters where if the water level drops, well, now this water's kind of trickling out, and it's going to, like this, it's going to restrict how much it comes out this way. But more importantly, water levels become more difficult in air-powered filtration because air can only move the water so much further above the water level. So typically what we want is we want these to always be submerged, or our outlet tube on our sponge, breeder box, whatever it may be, to always be submerged. Because the second it starts getting out of water, it severely restricts the effectiveness of the filtration and basically almost cuts off the entirety of your flow and cycling that water around, which will inevitably reduce oxygenation in your tank. It becomes very, very dangerous for your fish. I know this one is a little long, but thank you for riding with me on talking air power filtration. This certainly isn't perfect. This probably could be easily an hour on each air-driven filtration method, just because there's so much nuance about placement, air rate, etc., 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 right? There's so many things, but I wanted to talk about this at a very high level to help you guys understand air-driven filtration compared to like a hang-on back like we did last week. Next week, we'll talk about canister filtration. There's a ton there too that might end up being a little long as well, so bear with me. I really appreciate it. If you've enjoyed this video, you enjoy kind of high-level understandings like this, give us a little like, set a comment down below. What was the thing that you found most interesting? And if you're not a subscriber, consider subscribing. I do all sorts of like little lessons and tips like this, just a myriad of things that I like doing when it comes to the filtration side of life or just the aquarium hobby in general. So with that being said, guys, thank you so much for watching, and stay awesome.